You look at the Republican Party's domestic policy priorities over the past couple of years, it's really hard to say that we've gotten anywhere just by smashing things.
Hi everyone, I'm Ian Bremmer. This is your GZERO world. Standing here in Battery Park, you can see the Statue of Liberty is still there. Policy developments to the contrary. I've got a great and relevant big interview for you today. It's JD Vance, the author of Hillbilly Elegy and known to many as kind of the whisperer for the Trump population in this country. We're going to talk about where America's heading and are there any solutions. And also something a little bit new for you this week. I think you'll enjoy. I've got Trump and Putin on set. You'll want to stay tuned. But first, the world this week. From Asia, President Trump, with his magical mystery tour, makes it back to the United States. It was 2 weeks, it was 5 countries, it was a bunch of summits. Frankly, went pretty well, right? I mean, in the sense that he didn't make any real missteps or gaffes while he was on the trip. The bilateral meetings went well. He was treated well by everybody. The speeches were pretty well received. The only thing people really got bent out of shape about is when he called, sort of, Kim Jong-un short and fat, which he's kind of done before, but he also did it out of missile range. He had already left South Korea and Japan. That's a smart time if you're going to insult him. Look, the biggest takeaway from this trip was the signing of the TPP-11, the agreement to move forward on that, which of course doesn't involve the United States. The U.S. left that multilateral trade deal. Not exactly the big takeaway you want to have from the most important presidential visit of his term so far. The individual meetings were pretty good, particularly Xi Jinping, who gave him a state-plus visit, right? This was by far the biggest deal that they've made of any visiting dignitary since 1949. That says a lot about the power of the American presidency, but also says a lot about the Chinese desire to distract away from the bigger, more thorny issues like, are we going to cooperate with the Americans on trade and make our market more open to them? We're going to stop engaging in intellectual property theft. The answer to those questions are no. There's some headline contracts that were signed. Every president does that. Shows that, yeah, we're going to see more money coming in, but really nothing of great significance. And, you know, moving on Trump's trade agenda with all of those countries running deficits, even the Japanese refuse to move ahead on a bilateral deal, which Trump says he wants. Overall, you give Trump an A- on the trip in terms of general expectations for how he was going to do with all these challenging visits, but you probably give him a D in terms of whether or not the ball's actually been advanced on policies that matter to American national interest. That has a little to do with Trump, but also has a lot to do with the state of the world today. And then to Lebanon, or should I say Saudi Arabia, with the Lebanese Prime Minister, or should I say ex-Lebanese Prime Minister, Saad Hariri, resigns his position from Saudi Arabia, saying that he's had to leave because he had security concerns and can go back, but not sure exactly when. The Saudis and Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman have been very upset with growing Iranian influence in Lebanese politics, particularly over Hezbollah, and they don't believe that their man Hariri is able to push back effectively. But the Lebanese political spectrum, which is quite diverse, has all basically lined up behind the deposed-ish prime minister. So has American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson, who not only said the Americans still recognize him, but also called the Israelis to say, don't get on board with Saudi Arabia on this. Not exactly what Jared Kushner was saying when he came back from Saudi Arabia, what Trump was saying just a few days ago after these Saudi purges against many of the royals. Look, domestically, there are revolutionary changes afoot which are necessary and so far seem to be going okay for the Crown Prince. Internationally, whether we're talking about Yemen or whether we're talking about Qatar and now whether we're talking about Lebanon, it's a much heavier lift. So this is probably not the last we've heard from the Prime Minister-ish Hariri. It wouldn't surprise me if that resignation turns to be kind of short-term and temporary. And if we're starting with Asia, gotta end with Zimbabwe. Is it a coup? The military says no, but it smells like a coup. I mean, they took out the ZBC, that's their state broadcaster, and Robert Mugabe looks like he's under house arrest. They say he's safe. He says he's safe, but that doesn't mean he's in power. Mugabe has been in power since 1980. That's when we had the Pina Colada song by that guy that did the Pina Colada song. No one should be in power that long. He's in his 90s. He's trying to get his 52-year-old wife, Grace, to be in charge. That's why he ousted the vice president, who had a lot of support from the military. If he was a little more cognosmentis, he probably would have realized that that was a bad move. But the military has now stepped in, and I think this is the end of Mugabe. Frankly, a nice piece of news for all of us today. And now, something very different. We have international conflict, but domestic dispute. It's puppet regime.
Okay, guys, I'm glad you're here. And I want you to remember the important thing as we work through this is that we be honest with one another. No post-truth nonsense in this office, okay? So, who'd like to begin? Donald?
What you said over the summer, Vladimir, that I am not your bride. It was very unfair and hurtful, and I was just very, very hurt.
I thought we have agreement, Donald, not to let truth become problem for us. But suddenly you never remember what you tweet. This is main problem with you. You are always
that's
on
the
phone,
problem?
always on
That's
social
the
media.
That's the problem?
Yes, is one of problem. Look, I put so much online for you, for us, to remove woman who stood between us.
Okay, just prove it.
Now in America is hysterical. They drag our name through mud, and you are just.
Please, look, first of all, okay, he loves it, okay? Let me just tell you, okay? I mean, he loves that he is the center of attention in America, okay? To be honest, I'm surprised he can even keep his shirt on just sitting here, okay? Will you please? Okay? So he loves, okay? And the other thing, look, if things get bad with me, he's just gonna run off with China, okay? That I can tell you, China.
How dare you
I've
bring
seen it
her
before.
into this?
I call it China Maples, really. I know. She just uses and uses and uses you, Vladimir. It's a disgrace, really. I mean, I can hardly
I
even-
don't need American permission.
I mean, she
for...
treats you like a puppet, really.
No puppet, no puppet. You are puppet.
Even though the country is so different, we're still fundamentally trapped in this debate between Johnson and Reagan.
I'm here in Naples, Florida with JD Vance. He is a partner at Revolution LLC. He is contributor at CNN, but everybody knows him from Hillbilly Elegy, his #1 New York Times best-selling book, which is kind of the Bible of understanding the Trump voter in the country right now. JD, glad you're here.
Thank you.
I want to start a little personal.
Yep.
Because as a kid from the projects myself, I felt connected to you when you talked about your Meemaw,
Sure.
your grandmother, who kind of made it possible for you to get the hell out of Appalachia,
Sure.
Kentucky, and then Ohio. When you look back at the way you grew up, what percentage of your success comes from simply the fact that you had someone in your family that could get you out of what everyone else was stuck in?
Well, I'd say half goes to Mamaw, probably 40% goes to everybody else in the environment that was really positive and influential for me, and then 10% goes to the Marine Corps. So I think in a lot of ways the lesson of my life is that when you grow up in really disadvantaged circumstances, you need a lot of things to go right. It's not one thing, it's not one policy, it's a number of people.
It came across very clearly that you're not necessarily thinking or looking for the government to provide solutions for people in this situation, because at least for you and everything that you saw, that's not what was moving the needle.
Government can help, but it can't solve all of these problems, right? When you talk about people who really feel disconnected and hopeless, when you talk about the problems of family trauma and domestic violence and family instability, it's hard to look at policy and say there's a clear lever that we can pull that is just going to make all those problems go away. Now, do I think the government could play a role in creating more job opportunities? Absolutely. Government could play a role in creating better educational opportunities, actually preparing people for the jobs that will exist in the 21st century as opposed to the jobs that existed 30 or 40 years ago. Yeah, absolutely. So I don't think policy is totally helpless, but how do you recreate the experience of a loving home and the support provided by Mamaw? That's a tougher question, and unfortunately it doesn't always have a policy answer.
So it's easy to say government's broken, right? It's easy for us to complain, but there are a lot of things that feel broken when you read your book and when I talk to you about your life, right?
Yep.
The family seems broken, the
Sure.
schools sort of seem broken. If you could wave a wand and start with one thing that you think would make a difference, and I'm not talking government policy, any one thing, it would be what?
It'd be the family. It definitely would be the family. You know, the evidence that a lot of these disadvantages and lack of privileges accumulate before kids even enter school age is pretty overwhelming, right? So we talk about the instability that comes along with growing up in a pretty broken family. Talk about the domestic violence and trauma that is actually much more common than we might like to think in some of these families. If kids are growing up in a place where they don't know where they're going to go to bed that night, where they're not hearing a lot of support for education and learning in their house, and where they're worried that they're either going to go to bed being physically abused or emotionally abused, we can't expect that kids who grow up in those circumstances are not going to show a lot of the negative side effects of disadvantage.
Move to the more atomic family, big part of that or not? Are you one of these people who thinks, you know what, I mean, if the family unit doesn't actually cohere, you're going to have a real problem as a single X or as an aunt Y? I mean, you were raised in a fairly untraditional way.
It doesn't have to be a one-size-fits-all answer, but again, so many of the disadvantages we see accumulate in the lives of these kids before they're even 5 years old. We really have to start there and appreciate that that's, to me, the most significant source of disadvantage.
So, you went from this environment that is pretty deeply nativist to a life that is now very deeply globalist, right? I mean, the fact that we're meeting here in Florida and last time met in Aspen, and that's not your traditional Trump supporter, at least not at the base. How do you relate to the fact that your background is kind of ripped between these two poles? You in some ways are living this, and how do you connect with the people that come from where you came from?
Yeah. So definitely much better traveled now than I was when I was a kid. That's for sure. I really do think that being part of a place is a fundamental part of my identity. And if I was one of these kids who, quote unquote, made it out and completely severed all my ties to the old world, as they say, I don't think that I would be happy or comfortable. I think that in some ways, just because of who I am, it's really important to me to find that sense of rooting and identity in the place that I came from. And that's probably always going to be the case. It's always going to be the case that I'm going to want to maintain some connection to the places that really made me who I am. And not everybody's like that, of course, but that's certainly how I am.
Now, when's the first time that it became clear to you that there was a real nativist movement, political movement, in the United States that was going to matter?
I guess it depends on, nativist obviously has a number of different definitions, but, my sense of the Trump movement is that it was probably mid to late 2015 where I started talking to folks from back home and realized that there was something real here. Where
so
people
it was
were
Trump
passionate.
that got you started about that. It wasn't before then.
No. And I mean, I don't think that I would call Trump necessarily a nativist movement. I think it depends. Obviously, there are nativist elements to it. I think most of the folks that I knew who supported Trump and voted for Trump were not motivated by nativism in the sense that they were motivated by a fear of outsiders, unless you define outsiders as what we sort of pejoratively and
Democratic elites.
Democratic elites.
I
right?
would. Why wouldn't you?
Yeah. And if you're going to define nativist
Absolutely.
as anti-democratic elites, then absolutely.
Yes.
That was the sense that I got, is that there was this really broad-based feeling, even among folks who ultimately voted for Hillary Clinton, that those people, meaning the people who call the shots, have screwed something up. And it wasn't just Democratic elites. I mean, it was Republican elites too, whether it was the Jeb Bush or the Hillary Clinton or Marco Rubio or whoever. There was this sense that for a long time, we've been trusting a certain group of people to call the shots in business and in politics and in finance, and our lives aren't getting better. If anything, things are getting worse. And we need somebody who just is going to blow up that entire system. And that was really, so I guess the answer to your question is, it was recent when I started to realize that this was a real political movement. Now, that frustration was there. Frustration was there among Republican voters who were maybe really unhappy with the Iraq War. It was there among Democratic voters who were unhappy with bank bailouts or some of the policies of the Obama administration. You definitely saw that frustration with elites, but I never quite saw it in a coherent political movement until Trump started running for the presidency.
So when that happened, when you started seeing that movement cohere, and when you saw Trump whipping it up, was your knee-jerk response, uh-oh, this is scary, or was it finally someone giving voice to this?
Yeah, no, it was finally someone's giving voice to this. I mean, my natural inclination, I think, was to be really, really supportive of Donald Trump. When he went in, I'm a Republican, when he went during the Republican debate and said, we really screwed up the Iraq War. We should have done better. We should have taken better care of our veterans. Maybe we should have been taking care of the working class base of the party as opposed to the donor base of the party. And when he said those things, it really, really resonated with me. And there was a part of me that always really identified with Trump's message. And the criticism that I always had and the worry I always had is that you actually have to turn that frustration into a governing agenda. And that was really where I saw the breakdown. I didn't see that there was any way to connect that frustration with something that would actually make these problems better.
So Drain the Swamp
Yeah.
has a lot of resonance for you.
Sure.
Right? But I mean, if things are really that broken and have been for a long time, don't you need someone that just comes in and smashes the damn thing, right? I mean, you would think that you would then support that.
Yeah, well, I think you probably need somebody who smashes the thing, but if you smash the thing without any real sense of how to move forward, then are you really smashing it, or are you just letting the same old institutions that have not worked especially well replace the institutions that you're allegedly smashing? If you look at the Republican Party's domestic policy priorities over the past couple of years, it's really hard to say that we've gotten anywhere just by smashing things.
You did not vote for Donald. You were one of 5 people that voted for Evan McMullin.
That's right.
What was it that made you decide, that's it, I can't do this, despite all of the because he's very aligned.
He's absolutely
with
aligned.
you kind of philosophically.
Sure.
Right?
Look, there were a lot of parts that wanted to support President Trump, but at the end of the day, I just felt that unless you paired that recognition of the problem with an idea for how to move forward, you would end up in either the same situation the Republican Party had always been in, the country had always been in, or you'd maybe even be at a worse off point.
So in terms of what he's done so far,
Sure.
that you would give him an A?
Yeah, well, I mean, been really happy with judicial appointments and nominations, right? So I think you've seen a lot of good judges, folks that any solid Republican president would have appointed, so would give him a high marks there. I think that, despite the fact that there's a lot of rhetorical danger in the Trump administration with foreign policy, he hasn't actually made a significant foreign policy blunder yet. And that's actually, if you judge by the standards of recent American presidents, that's actually been pretty good. I think that you could make a really strong argument that most recent American presidents have gotten us into a significant problem overseas. I don't see that Trump has done that, at least not yet. And so in some ways, I think the best conduct of American foreign policy is to not get us into some of these significant blunders that other folks have gotten us into.
I mean, he's expanded Afghanistan troops, but I don't want to get into that in a big deal. I would rather ask you on the domestic side, do you think that his embracing of the identity politics piece, whether it's on the wall or it's on the Muslim ban or it's on the NFL, I mean, clearly it's useful politically for his base. But do you also think it's valuable for a population that has not felt like they've had a coherent sense of community for a very long time.
Yeah, I mean, look, some of the identity politics stuff makes sense to me politically, but at a fundamental level, we have to recognize that Republicans are still not a majority party in the country. They're at best 50% of the electorate, and probably
Probably less.
smaller than that.
Right, yeah.
And so often my reaction is, are we actually expanding the Republican tent? We saw recently in the Virginia elections, Gillespie was focused a lot on the identity politics issues, was not focused a lot on the economic issues and how to actually bring a more positive economic message from a Republican perspective to the electorate. And that only gets you so far. In Gillespie's case, it got him a pretty significant defeat. And I think that's going to be, unfortunately, the case for a lot of Republican candidates. Populism can't just be identity politics from the right. There has to be an economic piece of it, too.
Now, for a long time, there was this presumption that the sweet spot in American politics was be a social liberal and be an economic conservative. And it's, your Schwarzenegger effect and all these people. And you believe now that it's exactly the opposite. The sweet spot for the Republicans is really being a social conservative, but being an economic liberal. I guess I would say, what changed? And also, who do you think reflects that?
Well, I should say that I think that's the sweet spot for any American political party. If you look at where the average American voter is, they tend to be socially to the right of mainstream media and so-called elites, and they tend to be economically to the left. So that's not a place that's actually embodied by a lot of folks or really anyone in American politics. I think in some ways you can make an argument, especially during the primary season, that President Trump came closest. He was the one who was running as a social conservative, but also pretty critical of right-wing orthodoxy on trade and immigration and tax policy and so forth. So I think you can make an argument that at least rhetorically President Trump was trying to occupy that space, and it obviously worked for him.
Gay rights,
but again,
he kind of tilted back to New York City. And
yeah, but I mean, again,
transgender. Why not just eat those points,
So down the line, certainly he's not a social conservative, but I think he ran more to the right than, let's say, any Democratic Party candidate would run. And again, I think that's the sweet spot of American politics. The unfortunate piece of this, just for me and for my priorities, is that you have to actually turn the rhetoric of economic populism into actual policies. And so I always push back a little bit against the idea that what it is that we need to be running economically to the left. I think of myself very much as a conservative. But what I do think is we have to recognize that most voters are not right-wing libertarians on economics. They actually want the government to support working and middle-class Americans. The question is, what do you do with that? But the fact that so many in our politics can't even recognize that that's where the average American voter is, I think doesn't bode well.
I think most people understand the average American likes more money spent on them.
Sure.
So hence Obamacare, maybe not so popular until you have it and then don't take it away because I'm going to lose something, right? So are you basically arguing that I want to see more redistribution in the United States system?
I don't necessarily think that. I mean, in some ways we have a very progressive income tax right now. So it's not a question of more redistribution. It's a question of how do you actually make the economy work for the broad, middle, and working class of the country, whether they're on the left or whether they're on the right. To me, the question of redistribution, if you say, do we need more or less redistribution, you're fundamentally just throwing back to a political conversation that people were having in the 1980s, right? Do we want more of the Johnson administration and its policies in the 60s? Do we want more of the Reagan administration and its policies in the 80s? To me, that misses the way in which the country has changed in a very fundamental way. The problems that we're confronting right now are much different than just more or less redistribution. So you can say, for example, you want people to have more and better access to health care, but what form does that take? Because if you're not actually reforming the American healthcare system, if you're not reforming some of the monopoly power that certain drug companies, that certain providers have, then you can spend money all day on healthcare. It will be redistributive, but you may not actually get better healthcare outcomes in the process.
What do you think the United States should stand for as a country?
This goes back to my point about the identity politics issue and why I'm so uncomfortable with it sometimes on the right, is I think at our best, we stand for the idea that no matter what you look like, no matter what your race or religion is, you can be part of the American nation. It's a nation built around a common creed, a commitment to certain values, as opposed to who you worship or what color your skin is. That to me is the very best part of the country, but I worry that we're losing it because I worry that when you ask an 18-year-old kid or even a 35 or 55-year-old man, what does the country stand for? Not many people actually would give a consistent answer.
So you just had a child. What are you going to do to make sure that your baby grows up to have the values that you really respect and want to see in this country?
The most important thing for me is to make sure that the kid who is going to grow up with privileges that would have been completely fantastical to a young version of myself, to make sure that he grows up and has some connection to people who aren't necessarily given everything in their lives. So I want him to spend time with people that I grew up around. I want him to spend time with people who I didn't grow up around, but who have known real struggle in their life. Because without it, I think that he'll never really appreciate what a lot of folks in his own country are going through. And to go back to this question of being part of the same American nation, I don't think that many people actually empathize with the experiences that are shared by Americans, even those who live, 10 miles down the road. And I really don't want my kid to be like that. He's going to live in this incredible bubble. He's going to have a lot of money. He's going to have access to books and educational opportunities and so forth. But I want him to feel, if he meets a kid who grew up like I did, I want him to feel like he actually has some kinship with that person.
JD Vance, if you haven't read Hillbilly Elegy, what the hell is wrong with you? Thanks a lot, man.
Thanks.
See you soon.
Appreciate it. Yeah.
Look, Vladimir here, okay? He doesn't understand my life, okay? I have to deal with Congress, the failing media, their courts, and the treatment of me by all of these people is just very, very unfair.
Cry me a river, Donald.
Oh, cry me
If you don't
again.
like
Everything's about
media,
Crimea with
courts,
this guy. You can't talk
just
about
get
anything
rid
else.
of them.
Yeah, you think it's so easy, okay? But I see you up there on your...
Мы с вами, может быть, не повстречаемся. Мы разошлись, как море.
You see what I mean? You see?
Look, he won't publicly acknowledge our relationship, okay?
I acknowledge.
Every time our relationship comes into public, he just starts...
Radical Islamic terrorism, Ian. Uranium, football, ISIS.
Okay. Let me interrupt.
Sorry, what were we talking
Can you
about?
guys think of some things that you still do share? No, I mean, look, neither of you loves NATO. Neither of you wants America to be a superpower, right? I mean, you both spent the 1990s broke and hanging out with Russian criminals.
Not broke, Ian. I was not broke.
Your outfit in 1990s was criminal, Ian. I have seen picture.
Okay, well, you guys both love Steven Seagal.
Steven.
Is this what will sound like when doves will cry?
I don't know what I am feeling right now, but I am feeling something that is a feeling.
I also am feeling this. How do I crush this feel?
Take my hand.
Your hand. Your tiny little...
What? My tiny little what? You son of a...
Южный берег, бархатный сезон. Что поделать, это был не сон. Долгий
Populist!